In February 2026, Park Sunghoon carried the Olympic torch. Thousands of people lined the road, and as he walked, he could hear them chanting his name. He looked around, almost confused, and said to himself, "How do they know my name?" Sunghoon started figure skating when he was 8 years old. By 13, he was competing internationally. He won gold at the Lombardia Trophy, earned consecutive silvers at the Asian Open, and made South Korea's national reserve team. He even trained alongside people who went on to become Olympians. He had every reason to keep going. Instead, he wished to be a K-pop idol, one of the most publicly demanding jobs that exists. For someone who spent a decade learning to perform alone, it was an enormous leap. So then, why did he give it all up? To understand that, we have to go back to before he left the ice. If you enjoy thoughtful, positive content about enhypen just like this, consider subscribing. Sunghoon didn't start with figure skating. His parents put him in ice hockey first. He was shy as a kid, and they thought the team environment might help draw him out. It didn't stick with him. But one day at the rink, he tried figure skating on a pair of borrowed skates. No pads or protection at all, just the ice beneath him. He was 8 years old. He wouldn't stop for the next 10 years. Figure skating did something to Sunghoon that most other sports couldn't have. Being that it was an individual sport, every fall was his to get up from. Every mistake was his to fix. He trained for months toward a single performance, and when it was over, the score told him exactly where he stood. If he was having a bad day, he couldn't rely on any teammates. No one else was on the ice, just him and however good he actually was. Over those 10 years, that became the only way he knew how to operate. Sunghoon reflected back on this experience directly. Figure skating is something that I have to do alone. I have to navigate through everything and overcome challenges on my own. He got good, really good. By 13, he was competing internationally. Like I mentioned earlier, he won gold at the Lombardia Trophy, earned consecutive silvers at the Asian Open, made South Korea's national reserve team. One of the people he trained alongside was Cha Junhwan. Junhwan went on to become one of South Korea's most decorated competitive skaters, a world championship medalist and an Olympian. Someone so far ahead that all Sunghoon could do was watch and try to absorb whatever he could. He could have continued with Junhwan. Maybe Sunghoon would have accomplished the exact same things, maybe even more. But he didn't. From the outside, it looked pretty straightforward. All he would have needed to do is keep training and see how far he could get. However, years later, when someone asked Sunghoon what he'd tell his younger self during all that, he didn't mention the medals themselves. He didn't tell him to continue with figure skating. He said he'd tell him to be confident, to stop obsessing over the numbers and the scores. He was winning internationally as a teenager and still carrying that weight. The sport had given him everything, the discipline and ability to keep going alone when no one was watching. But it had also given him a habit of comparing himself and finding himself lacking. It's a very common internal pressure among athletes. Skating made him who he is. It literally got into his bones, and it would stay there long after he stopped competing. In 2018, Big Hit Entertainment found him on Instagram. I mean, at this point, he was 16, competing internationally, training alongside future Olympians on a path that made complete sense. And then Big Hit Entertainment found him on Instagram. He absolutely didn't walk away from skating immediately. For the next 2 years, he did both. Skating during the day, idol training at night. Two completely different worlds running at the same time. Two completely different versions of himself being asked for simultaneously. On the ice, everything was familiar. It was the same movements and the same standards he'd built his whole life around. But in the practice room, nothing was familiar. He was learning to sing, to perform in a group, and to exist in a way that required other people. The discipline from skating fed into the idol training. The hours he'd spent alone perfecting a single movement translated into something useful in the practice room. But the two worlds weren't really compatible. One asked him to be precise and self-contained, while the other asked him to open up, and to be the kind of person people wanted to watch. For a while, both could exist. However, the idol training was starting to feel like something he wanted, rather than something he was doing alongside something else. The rink was starting to feel like the thing he was holding on to, rather than the thing he was building toward. A couple of years before the company found him, he went to a BTS concert. He watched them perform for a room full of people who had saved up and traveled and waited just to be there. These people knew every word of their songs and practically knew everything about the people singing them. And standing there in that crowd, he realized something that'd been missing for him. He'd spent years performing for judges, for a panel and a scoreboard and a number that told him where he stood. But this was something else entirely. These people hadn't come to evaluate anyone. They'd come because they wanted to be there. They just wanted to have fun with the people on that stage that meant something to them. Sunghoon wanted that. Not high scores, that. He says that's the moment his dream completely changed. So when Island came around, he made the call to stop skating. Going into his final competition, he knew what it would be. He was a little sad to see figure skating go, but he had a new dream now, and he was ready to see it off the best way he could. He's continued to speak about figure skating, saying that even though he doesn't skate anymore, he thinks of it as something inseparable from who he is, that he'll always feel a little sad when he thinks about it. Not the kind of sad that means he chose wrong, just the kind that comes from loving something for a long time and having to leave it behind. What he was walking into was something 10 years on the ice hadn't prepared him for. Figure skating gives you a score. Island gives you a score. And the people voting weren't necessarily looking for technical perfection. They were looking for someone they wanted to keep around. Someone warm, funny, and expressive. Someone who filled the stage just by being on it. At debut, he described himself as never funny, never well-spoken, and someone who liked being alone. And later, a global audience would be deciding whether he deserved to stay. Back as a figure skater, a bad day stays on the ice. But here on Island, a bad day was recorded and broadcasted all over. The same people who saw those bad days would be the ones to decide his final ranking. During one of the later missions, the trainees had to perform two completely different concepts. One was dark and explosive, the kind of performance that plays to precision and control, the kind of thing Sunghoon understood instinctively. The other was soft and refreshing, built entirely around being effortlessly charming on camera. Sunghoon had been preparing for the first one, but then Sunwoo, who was leading the other team, moved him over. Taki had been eliminated and needed someone new. 5 days out from the performance, Sunghoon was starting from scratch with something that required him to be a completely different person on camera. Figure skating never asked him to be charming, it just required him to be good. Those are two very different things, and he struggled with it. He said so himself. But he pushed through, not because it came naturally, but because he had to for his dream as an idol. However, earlier in the show, Jay was struggling with a spin in the choreography. The other trainees started questioning among themselves whether he was good enough to keep the part. Sunghoon tried it on the side and got it down perfectly. That wasn't something he learned from idol training. It came from figure skating. Even if he wasn't practicing it right now, it was engraved in his body. He didn't even have to warm up. He just did it. There's a moment from his video diary during that period that says a lot about where his head was.
그리고 보컬 레슨도 오늘 들었고 좀 더 이제 내가 보컬 발성을 좀 더 키워야 할 것 같다는 그런 생각이 들었고 아직 멋을 찾기보다는 기본기를 먼저 다져야겠다는 그런 기본기 먼저 다져야겠다.
He also compared himself directly to the other trainees. Said that guys like Kay, Nikki, and Heesung were really good, and that compared to them, he felt he needed to improve more. At some point during Island, he said something that cuts through everything else.
이 길이 옳았다는 거를 꼭 부모님께 보여드리고 싶어요.
Not, I want to win, and not, I want to debut. He wanted to prove that walking away from figure skating was worth it. Years later, he'd be announced as a torchbearer for the Winter Olympics, but that's a long way from here. On September 18th, 2020, enhypen was announced. Sunghoon was in. That night, every member filmed a video diary. Heesung talked about what it meant. Nikki cried. Jake said he still couldn't believe it. And then there was Sunghoon.
또 이제 또 하나의 목표는 오늘 이제 이 데뷔조로 인해 목표는 이뤘고 더 큰 목표를 세워서 이제 데뷔를 해서 뭐 좋은 팀으로 데뷔를 해서 꼭 훌륭한 아티스트가 되겠다는 그런.
He'd spent a decade on the ice alone, and now the only thing he wanted was to be a part of a really good team. The problem was, being part of a team was only one of the things the job was going to ask of him. His early endnotes tell us a lot. Every member used those video diaries differently. Hee-sung would reflect pretty extensively. Sunwoo would talk about the view from his window, what he was feeling, and what the day had meant to him. And Jae would think out loud about what kind of person he wanted to become. But with Sunghoon, he'd log what happened, say he'd work harder, and sign off. 2 paragraphs, maybe 3. It wasn't that he had nothing going on inside. It's just that inside was where it stayed. Being a K-pop idol would usually mean he needs to be open and expressive. But the most visible thing about him was how much he kept to himself. It showed up in the music too. One of their early songs, 10 Months, had a soft and playful concept. He struggled with it. He said that he had a hard time pulling off the cute look. The songs he gravitated toward were the darker ones, like Give and Taken. Those felt closer to something he already knew how to be. Vocals were a different problem though. Figure skating has nothing to do with singing, and he knew it. The members he stood next to had been training their voices for years before any of them set foot on a stage together. In 2022, during promotions, he said that when he saw how much better he could actually be vocally, it didn't feel very good. Years later, he'd look back on that whole period and put it more plainly, that he used to be really hard on himself, finding faults in everything he did, telling himself it was because he wasn't good enough. So he did what he'd always done, started taking lessons, practiced between recordings, stayed after when he didn't have to. That same year, he became an MC on Music Bank. Just him, no members, on live television every week. It's worth understanding what that actually meant for someone like him. By this point, he'd found something in enhypen that he hadn't expected. 6 people he could be honest with, a group dynamic that made the group feel less impossible. They stay late into the night in the practice room, and then run out to get galbi at 3 a.m. And somewhere in all of that, he'd figured out how to be himself around people. And then Music Bank put him in front of a camera, alone, every week, and asked him to do it with strangers. He said he found it chaotic, that being engaging didn't come naturally to him. He took speaking lessons at the label just to sound less stiff. Back in December 2021, the members went to an ice rink together for an N-O'Clock episode. Most of them could barely stand up out there. They spun out, grabbed each other's arms, and laughed at themselves. And then Sunghoon performed a routine to one of their own songs, right there on the ice, in front of all of them. When they told him how incredible it was, he deflected immediately.
저의 전성기에 비하면은 한 10분의 1도 안 되지만.
Even though he knew he wasn't as good as he used to be, he spent the rest of the episode out there with them, teaching them how to move on the ice, how to stop tensing up, and how to just let it carry them. The ice had always been his alone. Now he was sharing it. A kid who grew up shy, who spent 10 years alone on the ice, learning to process everything internally, who walked onto Island describing himself as someone who liked being alone. By October 2023, something had changed inside Sunghoon. Enhypen were in the middle of their US tour, and after a show in Houston, he filmed a video diary. He said the crowds had been giving them energy, that the shows felt more satisfying than the year before. And then, almost as an aside,
저희도 개인적으로 이제 작년보다 더 성장한 그런 투어가 되는 것 같은데.
He said that back during Manifesto, everything was a first. New crowds and new environments, with all of it requiring his full attention just to get through. Now he knew how to adapt. He could arrive somewhere completely unfamiliar and settle into it much easier. Then February 2024 came around. It was the final night of the Fate Plus Encore concerts in Seoul, the last show of a tour that had taken them across the whole world and back. Sunghoon was mid-sentence during his closing remarks when it happened. He started crying. Jungwon was the first one to notice. He went straight to him, arms around him before anyone else had fully registered what was happening. Sunwoo looked over, and for a second he almost laughed. Not to mock him, but because he was surprised. In all the time they'd spent together, he'd never seen this. Sunghoon turned away from the audience, trying to get it together. Then he turned back, tried to keep talking, tried to finish what he was saying. He couldn't. The words wouldn't come out. The members wrapped their arms around him one by one. In the crowd, thousands of people who had traveled and saved and waited just to be in that room started chanting his name. It became too much. He sank into the ground. The members stayed with him, hands on his back and on his shoulders, just there.
엔지는 저를 유일하게 울게 한 사람이.
8 months later, he explained what happened. That he's the type to hold things in and let them out all at once. That small difficult moments had been quietly piling up without him fully realizing it. And then standing there on that stage, mid-sentence, it just hit him that he'd made it this far. He said he felt a lot better after. A little embarrassed that so many people had seen it, but better. In that same interview, he said something else. I think it was unconsciously in my bones from being a former athlete. You can't be an athlete for very long if you're inconsistent. I need to express it more when things get tough, though. I feel like I'm not very good at doing that, so I'm making an effort to express myself more these days. He'd spent his whole life learning how to hold it together. He was finally figuring out what it felt like to let go. In January 2026, it was announced that Sunghoon would carry the Olympic torch at the 2026 Winter Olympics. The Olympics. The same dream he'd put down when he was 18, coming back to him, just not the way he'd pictured it as a kid standing on the ice. On February 5th, Jungwon video called him on the way to the assembly point. The rest of the members were finishing a schedule in Taiwan. Jungwon asked if the relay was today, almost like he'd forgotten, and told him good luck. And then the call ended. He said he was nervous, but also excited in a way that was hard to put into words. When he got there, the streets were already full. More engine than he expected. He kept saying that. More than he expected. More than he expected. And then they started chanting his name through the streets. And he looked around trying to find where it was coming from. How do they know my name? He received the flame and carried it. As he walked, he made his way to the Arch of Peace. The flame he'd carried was still burning there. He stood looking at it for a moment, just looking, and then he said, "The torch flame I carried is burning over there. It's so cool. I'm seeing that for the first time, and it's really cool." That evening, he went to the opening ceremony. He looked around at the stadium, the biggest one in the city, and said, "We want to perform here someday too." He came to the Olympics carrying a dream he'd once had to put down, but he went home thinking about the team he'd chosen instead, and everything they still hadn't done yet. The next day, someone asked him about all of it, the skating, the decision, everything that came after. He said that his first dream was to compete at the Olympics as an athlete. He never got there that way. But standing in that city, having carried that flame, he felt like he'd realized it anyway. In 2015, a 13-year-old won gold at an international figure skating competition. He had no idea what that city would mean to him one day. 11 years later, he walked through the same streets carrying an Olympic flame, hearing thousands of people chant his name, genuinely surprised they knew it. He left the ice for a dream he couldn't fully explain yet, and somehow, the city where it all started was there waiting at the end. If you want to see Nikki's story as a child in the gruesome world that is the K-pop industry, you can click the video on screen. Thanks for watching! Bye 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 bye.